You asked for help once. Maybe you were 7, maybe 9. Maybe you were sitting at the dinner table and something was wrong, really wrong, and you said it out loud. And the room just continued. No one turned. No one asked what you meant. The conversation moved on like you hadn't spoken at all. So you learned something that day, something that took years to unlearn. You learned that your needs don't land, that asking is pointless, that the safest thing you can do is handle it yourself. And you got very, very good at handling it yourself. Today we're talking about the psychology of the ignored child. Not the abused child, not the child who was hurt, the child who was simply not seen. And why that quieter wound leaves marks that are harder to find, but just as real. Here's what most people get wrong about emotional neglect. They think it requires something to happen, a raised hand, a cruel word, a visible event. But emotional neglect is defined by what doesn't happen. The hug that never came, the question that was never asked, the room that never went quiet long enough to hear what you needed. Psychologist Jonice Webb, who pioneered research on childhood emotional neglect, describes it as a parent's failure to respond adequately to their child's emotional needs. Not a failure of love, necessarily, often a failure of awareness. A parent who was themselves never taught to see emotions, in themselves or in others. Which means you weren't ignored because you weren't enough. You were ignored because they didn't have the tools to see you. That distinction matters because one of those is your fault and the other is not. But the nervous system doesn't care about fault. It only learns patterns. And the pattern it learned in that house was this: emotional needs are invisible. Asking for help changes nothing. The only reliable person in this situation is you. So your nervous system built a system around that truth, a remarkably efficient, quietly exhausting system for never needing anyone. And that system looks different depending on the child, because there are two ways a child responds when their emotional needs are consistently unmet. Type 1, the hyper self-sufficient adult. This person decided somewhere around age 8 or 12 or 14 that needing people was the problem, that if you never needed anyone, you could never be disappointed by anyone. So they built a life that doesn't require asking. They solve their own problems before anyone notices there is one. They decline help before it's offered. They say, "I'm fine," so automatically it no longer feels like a lie. It feels like the truth. They are capable, incredibly capable. People around them marvel at how together they always seem. And they are exhausted in a way they cannot explain to anyone, because explaining it would require admitting they're not fine. And that's the one thing they don't know how to do. Type 2, the people pleaser still waiting to be seen. This person responded differently to the same silence. Instead of withdrawing from the need for validation, they chased it. If the attention never came freely, maybe it could be earned. So they became very good at anticipating what other people needed, at making themselves useful, at being agreeable, low maintenance, endlessly accommodating. They don't ask for help either, but for a different reason. Not because they don't believe in needing people, because they don't believe they're allowed to need people, that their needs are too much, that asking will drive people away, that love is conditional, and the condition is being easy. Underneath all that agreeableness, a child still sitting at that dinner table, still waiting for the room to go quiet, still waiting to be heard. Both of these adults are carrying the same original wound, the same original lesson. You are not someone whose needs matter enough to stop the room. And both of them are wrong. Not because that lesson wasn't real. It was real. It happened. The room really didn't stop. But the room was wrong, not you. Here's what the research shows about adults who experienced childhood emotional neglect. They tend to have difficulty identifying their own emotions, not because they don't feel things, but because no one ever helped them name what they were feeling when they were young. They tend to have a deep sense of being fundamentally different from other people, flawed in some way they can't quite articulate. They tend to be highly attuned to other people's emotions, hyper-vigilant to shifts in the room, while remaining disconnected from their own. And they tend to be extraordinarily hard on themselves for needs that are completely, entirely human. So, if you're someone who never asks for help, here is what I want you to hear. You didn't learn to be self-sufficient because you're strong. You learned it because the alternative, needing someone and being invisible, felt too dangerous to risk again. That's not strength. That's protection. And you've been protecting yourself for a very long time. You're not broken for finding it hard to ask. You're not weak for still needing. You're not too much for wanting to be seen. You were a child. You needed to be seen. And the adults in the room, for whatever reason, couldn't do it. That was their limitation. It was never your worth. The ignored child becomes an adult who was very good at being alone with their pain, who has refined the art of needing nothing, who has made a quiet life in the space where their emotions were never welcomed. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, they find their way to a therapist or a person or a moment where the room finally goes quiet and someone finally asks, "What do you need?" And they don't know what to say because no one has ever asked before. That's where the healing begins, not in becoming less self-sufficient, but in slowly, carefully learning that asking is allowed, that needing is human, that the room can stop for you. It always could have. Someone just had to show you. Are you type 1 or type 2? Drop it in the comments. I read every single one. And if this video found you at the right time, you're seen, you're understood, and it was never your fault.